In recent years, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East has grown more complex, involving overlapping alliances, intricate webs of economic dependencies, and conflicting national interests. The Israeli-Iranian conflict, a cornerstone of regional tension, continues to escalate, particularly after Iran's recent missile attacks on Israel. At the center of this tension is not just military aggression, but also the importance of energy, namely oil, and the role it plays in fueling conflict, sustaining regimes, and influencing global power structures. In light of this, it is crucial to unpack the intricate dynamics between Israel, Iran, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and how energy security plays into the broader conflict. The complexity of retaliation. When Iran launched approximately 180 ballistic missiles at Israel, it reignited a long-standing debate about how Israel should respond. Military experts often categorize retaliatory targets into two types: counterforce and countervalue. Counterforce targets include military installations, missile systems, and defenses that would weaken Iran's ability to sustain future attacks. Countervalue targets, on the other hand, would focus on assets crucial to Iran's economy and society, such as its energy infrastructure, specifically oil production and refineries. Israel's immediate choices are limited. Should it focus on Iran's missile systems, aiming to reduce the chances of future attacks? Or should it aim to cripple Iran's economy, which would undoubtedly weaken Iran's ability to fund future military engagements? The former is more of a short-term military strategy, while the latter could have longer-lasting geopolitical and economic consequences, particularly in relation to global oil markets. Targeting Iran's energy sector, a risky yet lucrative strategy. One of the most compelling options on the table is targeting Iran's energy infrastructure. Iran's economy heavily depends on its oil sector, with 80% of its exports derived from energy production. More critically, half of Iran's government revenues come from energy exports. Targeting Iran's energy production would therefore not only cripple its economy, but also restrict its ability to finance military actions, both directly and through proxy groups like Hezbollah. This strategic option is particularly enticing because of Iran's Dutch disease vulnerability. The term Dutch disease refers to the phenomenon where a country becomes overly reliant on one sector, in this case energy exports, at the expense of other industries. If Iran's oil production were eliminated or even severely restricted, its other industries, which lack the infrastructure or investment to fill the void, would be unable to compensate. This economic collapse could destabilize Iran domestically, potentially leading to political upheaval and weakening the government's ability to conduct military operations. However, this strategy comes with significant risks. For one, while Iran's oil output only constitutes 3% of global supply, oil is a highly inelastic commodity. This means that even small disruptions in supply can lead to disproportionately large price hikes on the global market. For countries like the United States, this would result in a political nightmare, especially as rising gas prices hit American consumers, who are highly sensitive to such increases. With a U.S. presidential election looming, the Biden administration is particularly wary of any move that could destabilize oil markets and hurt domestic approval ratings. Additionally, Israel's international relationships come into play. While Israel has historically acted unilaterally in many of its military actions, including those that the U.S. might not support, this particular situation carries global economic implications. If Israel strikes Iran's oil facilities, it would not only upset oil prices, but also further complicate relations between major global powers like the U.S., China, and Russia. The U.S. dilemma: oil prices and global strategy. While Israel might see the strategic value in crippling Iran's oil production, the United States finds itself in a precarious position. On one hand, Washington supports Israel's right to defend itself, particularly against an aggressive regional power like Iran. On the other hand, any military action that significantly disrupts global oil supplies would likely lead to a sharp increase in oil prices, a development that could have wide-reaching effects on the U.S. economy and its global strategy. The United States also faces the challenge of managing its broader Middle Eastern alliances. Israel is a key ally, but so is Saudi Arabia, another major player in global energy markets. If Israel were to strike Iran's oil infrastructure, The global oil market would rely heavily on Saudi Arabia to pick up the slack by increasing its production. While this might seem like a simple solution, it is complicated by Saudi Arabia's membership in OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, which has been working to control global oil prices by limiting production. At present, Saudi Arabia is limiting its oil output as part of OPEC's cartel pricing strategy. This allows the kingdom to benefit from higher long-term prices by controlling supply. However, if Iran's oil were suddenly removed from the market, Saudi Arabia might be pressured to increase production to stabilize prices. While this might seem like an economic boon for Saudi Arabia in the short term, it would also force the kingdom to break with its OPEC partners, potentially jeopardizing its long-term pricing strategy. Saudi Arabia's strategic role. Saudi Arabia holds a unique position in this web of geopolitical calculations. As Iran's regional rival, Saudi Arabia stands to gain economically from any disruption to Iranian oil production. If Iran's oil exports were disrupted, Saudi Arabia could step in as a replacement supplier, boosting its own revenues. However, this economic benefit comes with significant risks. For one, Iran has previously targeted Saudi oil infrastructure in retaliation for its role in regional conflicts, particularly the war in Yemen. In 2019, a series of drone attacks targeted Saudi refineries, briefly halting nearly half of the kingdom's oil production. While the Houthis, a Yemeni rebel group allied with Iran, claimed responsibility for the attack, both Saudi Arabia and the US believed that Iran was directly involved. If Israel were to strike Iran's oil infrastructure, it is highly likely that Iran would retaliate against Saudi Arabia, either directly or through proxies like the Houthis. This would escalate the conflict beyond Israel and Iran, drawing Saudi Arabia into the fray and potentially destabilizing the entire region. Moreover, Saudi Arabia's involvement in such a conflict would have far-reaching implications for its relationship with the United States. While the US has long relied on Saudi Arabia as a key ally in the Middle East, particularly in terms of energy security, the kingdom's growing ties with China complicate matters. China is one of the largest consumers of Iranian oil and would be significantly affected by any disruption to Iran's energy exports. As such, China might pressure Saudi Arabia to refrain from increasing production, further complicating the situation. The role of China and Russia. China and Russia, two major global powers with vested interests in the Middle East, play significant roles in this complex geopolitical web. China is one of Iran's largest oil customers, and any disruption to Iranian oil exports would have a direct impact on its energy security. As a result, China is likely to oppose any Israeli strike on Iran's oil infrastructure, both diplomatically and economically. Russia, on the other hand, might benefit from such a strike. As mentioned earlier, Russia is currently grappling with the economic fallout from its war in Ukraine and the resulting sanctions on its energy exports. If Iranian oil were taken off the market, global oil prices would rise, providing a much-needed boost to Russia's economy. Additionally, weakening Iran's ability to supply arms to Russia would further complicate Moscow's military strategy in Ukraine. However, Russia's interests are not solely aligned with Iran. While the two countries have cooperated in the past, particularly in Syria, Russia is also wary of becoming too dependent on Iran for military and economic support. As such, Russia's response to an Israeli strike on Iran's oil infrastructure would likely be cautious, balancing its own economic interests with its broader strategic goals. The escalation spiral. Could it lead to war? At the heart of this complex geopolitical web is the risk of escalation. Israel's decision to strike Iran's oil infrastructure could trigger a broader conflict involving not just Israel and Iran, but also Saudi Arabia, the United States, Russia, and China. The potential for miscalculation is high, particularly given the number of actors involved and their competing interests. If Israel were to strike Iran's oil infrastructure, Iran would almost certainly retaliate, potentially targeting Saudi Arabia's oil facilities in the process. This would draw Saudi Arabia into the conflict, further destabilizing the region and potentially leading to a broader war. The United States, while hesitant to support such a strike due to the potential impact on global oil prices, would be forced to respond, particularly if its allies in the region were directly targeted. Russia and China, meanwhile, would likely attempt to mediate the conflict, though their motivations would be driven by self-interest. Russia would benefit from higher oil prices, but would also be wary of further destabilizing the region, while China would be primarily concerned with maintaining access to Iranian oil. In conclusion, the situation is a highly complex and delicate balancing act, with no easy solutions. Israel's options for retaliation against Iran are fraught with risk, particularly when it comes to targeting Iran's oil infrastructure. The potential consequences, both economic and military, could have far-reaching implications, not just for the Middle East, but for the entire world. As such, any decision to strike Iran's oil facilities must be carefully weighed against the potential for escalation and the broader geopolitical consequences.